Next we have Patrick Bond.
Wow, thanks, Anna. You're just amazing. Your English is much better than mine. I was born in Northern Ireland, and I grew up in Alabama. So some people think I'm Canadian some days, but it's just wonderful with this overview. You know, being in this room, because if it was a dozen years ago, we'd been sitting in the room Transact, right? This is much better. This is you can feel the progressive sensibility. We actually start our meetings in South Africa, and Leo and Sam Gindin were in South Africa a couple weeks ago. Manda! Away to power to the people. And it really feels, you know, the 26 years I've lived in South Africa were interrupted 12, 13 years ago by a sabbatical that Leo, John Saul, hosted, and these, you know, amazing, heroic activists and scholars. Judith from 1990 had helped us connect. Ali Perkins, we've worked on Nicholas Short. I mean, so many of you John Mutumbira, so many of you in the city who've helped shape the way I think about the world and given a sort of confidence as you host visitors at York, U of T here in the city. You really are an incredibly important site for the world left to come and replenish and to revive. So I think some of those debates in the old Empire seminar that Leo had put on really helped me think about whether the divergences, the critical debates we had with each other about how global capitalism was working out might nevertheless allow us to look at something like BRICS with a common perspective. Because as Anna had said, this is an exceptionally difficult period. Her government is cracking at the seams. I hope mine will too. We'll talk about those if you like a little later after a couple of beers at the pub. South Africa and Brazil is very interesting points of stress. But you know, this world economy is so fucked up right now, right? So massively over accumulated. The capitalist crisis that's just building, that's finding its way into financial markets with derivatives that might take down Deutsche Bank, with a shipping crisis. Last night in New York, Anna and I launched with two other colleagues from Rio and Hong Kong, Rosa Luxemburg Foundation report called Take the Ports. So we're very interested in our port cities, Durban, South Africa, Rio, Hong Kong, as sites where some of these extraordinary global capitalist contradictions intensify the metabolism of capital nature crises, of capital society crises. I must add that it's not just shipping, which is so vastly overcapacitated that we're looking at huge infrastructure investments in infrastructure, shipping, logistics in South Africa that add to what's called a Baltic Dry Index that has reached an unprecedented low level. So to ship something around the world is cheaper than ever because we have 20,000 container long ships coming off the lines in Busan, Korea, that have put overcapacity at massive levels. Or another example, steel. Judith is a former steel worker. 1.1 billion tons a year coming out of China. They only consume about 400 million. So the rest of it's coming in and wiping out the South African industry, I assume, elsewhere. So we're in a global capitalist crisis of overaccumulation. This isn't something that Leo always encouraged me to argue, but I think we'd all admit that this acute uneven development and the way in which, for example, our mining sector has taken a hit, our commodity prices for coal, $170 a ton in 2011, $50 today. And titanium, that's one that last week led to the assassination of Siko Sipo Bazuka Kadebe in Kolobeni, 2 hours south of where I live, a very heroic leader of an anti-mining movement. So his name's in the circuits now as somebody we really defend, and lots of fear about the rest of that struggle, which was in a film that won a Toronto award, The Shorebreak. Those are the kinds of things we really feel on the ground in sites like South Africa, acute, uneven, and combined development. The way Mauro Marini, the Brazilian, describes sort of overexploitation, super exploitative processes as capital comes to grips with this crisis by intensifying everywhere, by externalizing its costs as much as possible. And there, to come to the point, the allies are the BRICS, the sub-imperial BRICS that are actually not just part of the system in the way Anna has described, but actually exacerbating many of these aspects. So let me build really on exactly what she said with three quick cases. Once I make these cases, you'll have to agree with my characterization, especially the third one, as BRICS sub-imperialism. The three are finance, the climate, and soccer. FIFA, the World Football Association. So first, just as Anna said, this global financial restructuring, the attempt to reform the IMF is one example, is very revealing. In December, the Republicans in the US Congress finally agreed that the IMF could have its voting shares rejigged a bit. So who won from that? So 4 of the 5 BRICS won. Different ratios, but between about 9% and 33%. I think China was 32% increase in the voting share at the IMF. Is that something anybody's following? Really, really interesting, right? Because the kind of critique of the IMF is we in the third world don't have enough voice. The word voice comes up in these voting quota reforms. So okay, now they get more voice. But it turns out that there are losers, and the losers include Venezuela, 41% decrease in voting share. Nigeria, the largest African society and economy, 41%. Even South Africa lost 21%. So the idea that the BRICS are in solidarity with the South falls apart upon a little closer examination. Similarly, the BRICS have started their own alternative to the IMF called the Contingent Reserve Arrangement. But look at the fine print, it's really quite disturbing. And some very, very sharp people, I was with Mark Weisbrot in Washington a couple of days ago at the Center for Economic Policy Research. Superb institution, Mark's as sharp as you get. Or Radhika Desai at Manitoba. Or actually I could go on Horace Campbell at Syracuse. Walden Bello in the Philippines, just brilliant comrades. But they think that the CRA is an alternative, the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, $100 billion sort of reserve pool, that if you go into foreign debt and you can't repay, South Africa, $140 billion foreign debt, we probably can't repay, so we're going to need a loan. Turns out that the neoliberals in the BRICS got together in Fortaleza, and they designed this CRA right from the outset, the hard wiring, so that you don't actually get an alternative to the IMF. Here's what you get. South Africa puts in $10 billion to this pool, so its quota is what it can borrow. But its ability to do that is limited by a clause that says once you borrow 30%, you have to go to the IMF to get a structural adjustment loan, then you come back for your other 70%. How's that for increasing the leverage of neoliberalism in the IMF? Likewise, the BRICS New Development Bank is meant to be the alternative to the World Bank. But what we've seen over 30, 40 years of progressive social movement, NGO, community, some labor organizing, feminists, a few other groups, to make the World Bank a slightly less obscene institution. That the reforms won will be rolled back because a new development bank of the BRICS will just ignore that. We know that from some of the personnel and some of the things that they've already committed, at least orally. The South African representative who was in Toronto, John Saul remembers him, Tito Mboweni. He's the main director. There's another Leslie Masdorf. So Tito Mboweni comes from Goldman Sachs. He was the central bank governor. And he went on record last July after they announced this at the UFA summit of BRICS in Russia, that yes, when the newscaster said, well, you're thinking about buying nuclear energy, $100 billion per shot, 8 nuclear facilities. So would the BRICS New Development Bank be your lender? Absolutely, it's within the ambit. And that's what we're terribly worried about in this unfolding, unraveling corruption scandal in South Africa. The family from India called the Guptas are the main uranium buyers, and all kinds of connections to the Russians are now being unveiled, even in the last couple of days. So we're looking at something where if the BRICS were serious about alternatives to the Bretton Woods institutions in world finance, they had an option, didn't they, called the Bank of the South from Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. But they ignored it. In fact, the Brazilians, I understand on good authority, actually sabotaged Chavez's Bank of the South as a genuine alternative. Well, the second is climate, because just as you heard, we've had this disastrous experience with the Paris conference. What is it? United Nations Framework Conference? COP, what is that? Conference? COP21. It's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of the polluters. And those COP21, we have to rename this.
You set it up there.
Yes. And the COP21, like the COP17 in Durban, will ensure, at least in Africa, 200 million early deaths, the scientists are saying. 4 degrees is likely because they set a 3 degree, but they've got no binding agreements. Most importantly, the COP21 agreed with the guy Todd Stern, the main negotiator from the US, to have no liability for the loss and damage, the destruction of climate change to the people who caused it. Okay, people in Toronto, people like me who fly around too much. But the northern powers, the West, that has got that huge ecological liability and ecological debt, now could get off scot-free because of that deal. And that deal was prefigured in Copenhagen when 4 of the 5 BRICS got together in a green room and they did the deal, the Copenhagen Accord. Part of the strategy as well is to amplify carbon trading. We call this the privatization of the air, in which you ask, well, the biggest crisis ever, right, the climate crisis, who should solve that? Well, obviously the bankers, right? Let's sell the air and let the bankers do carbon trading. So that's the spirit of the BRICS, amplifying, not ameliorating or providing an alternative. And finally, we have in the year 2010, South Africa, year 2014, Brazil, 2018, Russia hosting the World Cup. And that's this transition that we talk about a fair bit in our new pamphlet from Rosa, and you can find it online for free, a sort of mega events strategy. So maybe we can hear from Anna about the Rio Olympics and the sort of extraordinary white elephant construction. There's even a guy called Donald Trump with 5 towers in Porto Marfil, right?
Yeah.
Which aren't really going to be built, but maybe they will. But I mean, this is the sort of exception. We have in Durban 2 massive stadiums. There's a little city called Edmonton that didn't want the Commonwealth Games in 2022, come to think of it. Why? Ridiculous waste of money, right? White elephants, Commonwealth Games. So who gets it? Durban, right? So Durban gets to take up another couple of $1 billion worth of subsidies for these mega events. And that's Sepp Blatter. And it turned out last May, just as our book was going to press, that the deals that get done, so that South Africa wins the World Cup in 2010, could $10 million bribe. And so the United States FBI and sort of getting into the dirty deals, and last week FIFA, the mother body, having kicked out Sepp Blatter finally, they've got a new head, and he's now coming back to South Africa. Hey, wait a minute, we gave you the World Cup, where's that 10 million? Oh, this guy Jack Warner took it, he's a Caribbean. So there's an extraordinary moment where you really see unveiled the deep corruption. Let me call it in soccer imperialism, in which the nurturing, the legitimating, and the financial support for these mafioso soccer administrators in Zurich come from the BRICS, at least 3 of them. There, I've made my case. No one can dispute sub-imperialism once I say FIFA, Sepp Blatter. That's just that. So let me very quickly end by suggesting that the next BRICS summit could be quite revealing, just as Anna's done by so wonderfully giving you a sense of the architecture of this project and how it's sort of fused together. And we really thank Leo for introducing me to Anna. The networks that you find in the Socialist Register, where Anna and Virginia Fontes have a great essay a couple of years ago, or the networks that we find in this lefty BRICS from the middle, once we confront our friends and comrades who are, petty bourgeois academics like us, who are BRICS from the middle, looking upwards, gazing, with admiration, careerist, failure of analytical nerve, you know the type. So what we found was a need to continually ground the arguments we're making in the realities of people in struggle, like Sipho Radebe, who was assassinated the other day. And those comrades in struggle, which we're going to hear about in one particular case, Vale, where Judith has done such remarkable networking, they're, I hope, increasingly capable of finding the spirits of solidaristic work, not, as unfortunately South Africa often represents our working class turning xenophobic, but instead finding internationalisms that can challenge country borders, Western corporates, and BRICS corporates. As we see, for example, our steel industry melting down. Yes, it was a South African-owned, state-owned steel company, Iscor, but it was sold to a guy called Natal. And he's Indian, and his company is called ArcelorMittal, the biggest in the world. And he's shutting foundries left and right. The second biggest is run by Roman Abramovich, who also owns Chelsea, the football club. And his company, Highfeld Steel, he's just shut down. Thousands left unpaid and out of work. So the world capitalist crisis doesn't give us BRICS as some coherent block. It's actually making all of these exceptionally difficult processes of overaccumulation and devalorization much more intense intra-BRICS. And in a way, we heard about Jim O'Neill from Goldman Sachs, rah, the BRICS are the building blocks of the 21st century. But it was very revealing last November that Jim O'Neill's company, Goldman Sachs, shut down its BRIC fund. They didn't have South Africa, so it's called BRIC. And that fund was about $900 million US, and it sunk about 88% in value because the stock markets and the currency devaluations and so forth had really made a mess of that whole fantasy that big capital had, financial capital. And it's at that level when you go to deep into the financial workings and you say, well, why don't you like the BRICS so much anymore? Well, they're fighting amongst each other. And it turns out it's true. So some of the updates we're doing on this show, the internecine competition of world capitalism. So we'll come finally now to the next BRICS summit, which will be in Goa. And just as we've heard that there's a really wonderful buzz and people in the Marini tradition, in the Brazilian left, the intellectual left. South Africa's got a vibrant intellectual left, and I think most of our comrades are fairly clear BRICS is going to make these problems worse. We then turn to India, and I'm really looking forward if any of you have the contacts, because when I was in Delhi, we launched the book in January, both in Delhi at Nehru University and then in Mumbai in the Tata Institute. Tremendous debates, and we had our two contributors, one of them, Achin Vanaik, a well-known leftist there, Vijay Prashad was the other. And the spirit of debate, and as they go on October 7 to 9 to the next BRICS summit in Goa, I think we're going to be very, very impressed with the way Indian intellectuals and the base there rise to the challenge. It's a challenge that we faced with Dilma and Lula, actually, in Brazil, with Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma in South Africa, and with especially Modi in India, which is that BRICS give these tyrants, these corrupt neoliberals, posing often as populists, a way to say, we are changing the world. Mm-hmm. And our argument is, yes, you are, for the worse. Thanks so much.